I was watching this year's Game Awards with a group of friends when the trailer for Control Resonant was released. This drew perhaps the most excited reaction of the night, and they urged me to look away in an effort to avoid spoiling myself on any previous entries. I did as told and was so swept up in the positive reaction and general buzz online that the following day I bought Alan Wake 1, 2, and Control, then buckled up for a wild ride of very high highs and some low lows. These games from Remedy Entertainment are ambitious, creative, and overflowing with passion. After completing these titles, I'm eager for what's next. And yet, these games have notable issues and consistent flaws that hold them back in my eyes from reaching the status of true masterpieces. The original Alan Wake is a wild ride of interesting concepts held back by repetitive, frustrating mission structures and outdated gameplay. Looking at it in the context of Remedy's other releases, I feel as though this game walked so that others could run. You can absolutely see sparks of creativity and promise through the mostly tedious experience of playing this game. I don't regret my time with Alan Wake, but it's a game I find myself very hesitant to recommend to others. Storytelling in Alan Wake is disjointed and trippy, which works both as a strength and weakness for the game. At times, I'm happy to be along for the ride as I'm kept in the dark, not fully understanding the events transpiring and feeling as though I've stumbled onto a unique narrative structure. Other times, I feel as though this confusion merely serves as a distraction for a lack of substance. Stephen King is mentioned by name in the game's opening line, and his stories clearly serve as a source of inspiration for the narrative of Alan Wake. The hook is a supernatural disappearance in a small town, followed by a sequence of increasingly unsettling events that perfectly line up with the manuscripts you have been finding on your journey. It's quite a cool plot device to keep finding these scattered pages that hauntingly foreshadow exactly what happens next. You play as Alan Wake himself, an author who's hit a writer's block and has a bit of a troubled past. Substance issues, relationship woes, and a bit of a temper with the press all plague him. But beyond a bit of an interesting backstory, I didn't love him as the main character. He's quite self-serious and a bit of a jerk. At no point did I feel as though he was exceptionally charming, intelligent, or physically capable. Towards the end, he did grow on me a tiny bit as a few of his quips broke through, but for the most part, I just didn't feel too attached. However, one of the supporting characters, Barry, I actually really enjoyed. He's so ridiculously out of place in this grim setting, and his dumb lines made me feel as though the game was embracing a bit more of a campy vibe that knew it was cheesy and played into it anyways. And I do think when I shifted my headspace to viewing it through that lens of being a bit more goofy, my enjoyment increased. The dated graphics lent no favors to creating a cinematic environment, since tense moments can be cheapened by low quality models and stiff animations. That said, there are undoubtedly some moments that remain unnerving, which is all the more impressive given the technical limitations. There are some interesting ideas at play here, such as the main source of the manuscripts and how they came to be, which of course treads into spoiler territory. Once things got moving, I felt my enjoyment picked up a bunch beyond the 4th chapter. But one of my biggest issues with the writing is how it feels like you make very little progress with many of the missions. Sometimes you are asked to meet someone on a mountaintop, and after spending 45 minutes trudging through the forest to reach them, you find a note saying they're on a different mountaintop, leading you on another predictable journey of forest walking. It can feel as though the plot is standing still while you perform the same actions repeatedly. To really drive this idea home of recycled plot points, Alan Wake himself even admits during the game, quote, "I'd fallen off of so many cliffs at this point, it's gotten ridiculous." Unfortunately, despite ramping up near the end and piquing my interest finally, the game's ending is open-ended in a way that is completely unsatisfying rather than leaving you room to thoughtfully consider the conclusion. In general, this is indicative of a pattern at Remedy where I believe they create stories on top of a foundation of spectacle and cool ideas, which can lead to exactly those elements with lots of success. But when it comes to creating a structured, satisfying plot, it often falls short. Combat in Alan Wake is somehow both simple and unintuitive. Enemies are shrouded in darkness, so you must first weaken them with your flashlight before dealing damage with a proper weapon. Maybe it's just a skill issue, but I found the weakened effect to be quite hard to read, often not understanding when enemies were able to take damage. At the same time, I felt like I was constantly needing to reload since my revolver had a limited magazine and my flashlight kept demanding fresh batteries. Juggling reloads and being unable to tell when threats were properly vulnerable meant that early on I would simply run out of ammo and lose the encounter in a very boring way. But the real fight was with the third-person camera. The majority of the game takes place in forests, and I found the perspective to constantly be clipping through and behind trees, making it difficult to clearly assess the combat situation. In addition to this, enemies would appear very spread out, circle around you, and use ranged attacks that were nearly impossible to anticipate when telegraphed off screen. This led to frustrating camera spinning and frequent cheap shots that didn't feel fair to be on the receiving end of. Thematically though, the idea of of using light sources for combat utility was kind of cool. There were some moments where a well-placed flashbang, multi-kill, or defensive flare felt good to use, but these were an uncommon occurrence amongst shallow and frustrating encounters. Despite some clearly lower fidelity characters, the environments still at times have a strong atmosphere to them, which is fitting for the setting of this horror novel come to life. The sense of space is also done well, and each level feels connected to the larger area. As you approach Bright Falls from the water in the opening sequence, you get a good view of the town and its surrounding mountainscapes, which helps to set the context for your adventure effectively. For the negatives though, this game was trying to be realistic but is clearly aged. You spend way too much time in forests that all look the same. Moving from one objective to the next felt like I could have just been going back and forth along the same path for most of the game. And lastly, it's just too damn dark. With no proper global illumination, areas in shadow are sometimes nearly black, which does no favors in adding detail to the world. At this point, I've mentioned the same gripe from the perspective of art and story, but once again I'll emphasize maybe my biggest issue with Alan Wake, which is the repetitive nature of the mission structure. It's an absolute slog. Get to a source of light, move on a linear path, shoot shadows along the way, reach a new light source, a crumb of confusing story information, rinse and repeat. And in terms of any power progression, they do this thing where you are constantly losing your entire inventory and then just getting it all back again. Nearly every hour you have your gun taken away and then predictably find the same gun model again. It was frustrating and uninteresting from a design perspective, and at some point even narratively distracting, because why are all these identical guns laying around in forests? And yet, like most other aspects of Alan Wake, there is a glimmer of potential, a diamond in the rough. Later in the game, there is a musical set piece that is hilariously enjoyable. It's such a subversion of the established genre that it comes as a lovely and much needed surprise. I wanted to draw attention to a handful of X-Factor positive components that don't exactly fit neatly into another category. First, and maybe one of the most prominent sources of intrigue and enjoyment from this game, is the mixed media content found throughout. You can discover a collection of live-action sci-fi shorts on TVs. I found each one to be well written, interesting, entertaining, and invoking a sort of surrealist tone. Part of the uncanniness comes from this weird effect where often the live-action actors are dubbed over by a separate voice actor. There are easily close to 10 of these, and without hesitation, each time I would stop and watch the entire 2 to 3 minute segment. Less entertaining but also worth listening to were the radio programs, which you could find tucked away in the levels. Finally, I have to note that enemies are meant to be the shadows of people who sometimes retain some character information or quirks from the humans they have taken over. This leads to them announcing very specific and bizarre lines at the start of combat. My favorite that I noted being, "Omega-3 fatty acids are good for your heart." It's so strikingly random and out of character, I couldn't help but laugh. When the game embraces this tone, I think it works best. The biggest piece of praise and fairness I can give to Alan Wake is that I think if I had played it when it released in 2011, I would have enjoyed it. Time wasn't on its side, and that can be okay. One of the most frustrating things about Alan Wake is that it feels like there are 4 hours of good ideas and moments hidden in a 10-hour game. In terms of non-standard action encounters, you would sometimes have stages of possessed objects that fling themselves at you until all obstacles have been cleared. This felt quite silly and didn't make for super interesting gameplay. Lastly, a distracting bug to mention is how dialogue would sometimes completely overlap. A character would be talking to me as I walked through a trail, but when I trigger the next dialogue, the first one wouldn't stop and I would be subject to a jumble of conversation. The first of the 2 DLC was The Signal, where I ran into a game-breaking bug in minutes and had to restart the level. But aside from that, I actually mostly enjoyed the condensed pace. It felt like a reimagined dreamlike version of the game with recognizable kit-bashed level elements. They try to go for even harder combat challenges, but again, the close-quarter third-person camera with multiple targets just feels brutal to play. Then I moved on to the Writer DLC, which was actually just non-stop banger set pieces. This was the first time that the physical level design lived up to the narrative in terms of being unique, trippy, and interesting. It almost felt like they played the base game, reflected on the strengths and weaknesses, addressed my feedback directly, and put out a short, polished, and creatively crafted experience. Alan Wake walked so that the following games could run. There's no doubt about that. The narrative implications and tie-ins are also definitely rewarding if you choose to start here, which I'm happy I did. Yet, if you're tight on time and not eager for an outdated experience, I would recommend watching a story summary video and then moving forward with the other Remedy games. This one is bloated and weighed down by dated art and gameplay, but aspects like the mixed media TV shows and manuscript foreshadowing still provide genuinely interesting and unique moments. I didn't love this game, but I was still excited to see what was next. Rolling right from Alan Wake into Control was like stepping forward in time. With nearly a decade between them, Remedy had honed their craft to create a better experience across all elements, culminating in a game that felt more effectively cinematic and fun, without sacrificing any of the odd quirks that gave memorable charm to Alan Wake. The opening sequence feels serious, ominous, and foreboding, without any stiffness or outdated technology cheapening the tone. It starts by introducing a metaphor to represent the themes of the game as being a hidden world beyond a poster of an ordinary room. I was immediately hooked and ready to jump in. Control still has notable flaws, but it is a confident step forward for this studio. Storytelling in Control follows a similar formula as before, shrouded in mystery, otherworldly phenomenon, and a character with little experience thrown into this world. But where Alan Wake follows a more literary path with themes of light and dark blended with a focus on art, Control dives headfirst into science. What if there was a secret government bureau that has been researching these anomalies? And the answer is that it would be pretty damn cool, throwing you, much like Jesse the protagonist, headfirst into a world full of new terms, departments, and devices worthy of filling out a textbook. It's so well constructed and detailed that the world becomes super believable and immersive. The fake science is cohesive and interesting, with so many papers and documents to read that you can get really deep into the lore if you so choose. At the same time, there's a distinct vibe to the setting that gives it character through the eccentric people you meet and the funny posters you find up on the walls, which at times reminded me of the TVA from Loki. In my notes, I had written early on that I found Jesse to be quite uninteresting in the lead role. Whereas I didn't love Alan Wake, he was at least distinctly a bit of a dick, where Jesse just kind of felt flat. However, I believe one of her most endearing qualities is the transformation in her confidence throughout the game. She wanders into this setting like a lost puppy with an understated voice and apprehension to the unknown, but towards the end develops a swagger and competence that is admirable. One of my main issues from her perspective with writing was that despite her views being mostly aligned with us and being in the dark to this world's secrets, her dialogue could be pretty indirect and unfocused, which came off as annoying more than anything else. I found myself thinking on several occasions, oh come on, why didn't you just ask this? It felt ambiguous for the pure sake of it to add interest, but it just ended up breaking my immersion as believable dialogue. As for the plot, things moved along well enough, but the first 2/3 were a bit heavy on task quests. Oh, you want my help? Go fix the pipes. You need information? Ask this guy who will tell you to visit another guy. The gameplay was fun enough, and the environment's pretty enough that I didn't get bored, but the repetitive structure that sometimes stalled the narrative was still peeking through below the fresh coat of paint and reminding me of Alan Wake to a much lesser extent. This goes away completely in the final act, as vague mystery makes way for a more directly compelling question, urging me to march forward to the game's finale, which was unfortunately a touch underwhelming. It definitely had a more conclusive resolution than Alan Wake, and yet there were a few too many loose ends for my liking. It feels like Remedy starts thinking about their next game a bit too much when they are near the completion of their current development. The art takes a huge leap forward, both in fidelity and direction. Fidelity is to be expected over time, but the stylistic choices and creative techniques are even more impressive and impactful. Control takes place inside an office building called the Oldest House, which is mostly composed of a distinct brutalist architecture. Lots of concrete and strong shaping. I really loved the look of it. They also use this mixed media overlay effect where a silhouette or video will shine from your point of view on top of a 3D environment, creating a really unique final look. It's quite a cinematic effect, and these unique choices help carve out an identity for this game's style, and there are two other elements I noted that helped achieve this. One is the use of color, which uses red as a primary accent to give flavor to the world. There's undoubtedly a strong association between that particular hue in the game. I have no doubt if I asked anyone who played Control to name the color best matching it, they would give you red. Next is the huge bold lettering to display the name of new areas as you enter them. It's not an entirely novel invention, but it stood out to me and felt really clean and polished. Combat in Control makes you feel like a superhero. As you progress through the game, Jesse accumulates more abilities that make encounters increasingly dynamic, as you can approach them in a variety of ways and carve out your own playstyle. Flying around, tossing debris, firing off different forms of your weapon, and seizing control of enemy units all made for a fun time. Little details like how the gun regenerates when you swap forms, or the burst of red smoke when enemies explode made it feel flashy and satisfying. I was particularly impressed by the density of objects you're able to grab and toss fast telekinetically. The flow of props in the environment seemed limitless, and even when depleted, you could rip chunks off the surrounding walls and pillars instead. Your weapon has a few modes to swap between, which let you pick what's best for each enemy type, and they all do their part. Short-range shotgun blasts make quick work of close-quarter foes, while charged precision shots aid your fight against flying combatants. I don't think the gameplay alone is so thrilling and unique that it's a reason by itself to play Control, but it does its part very well, and is a strength rather than a weakness. Especially in comparison to Alan Wake, I much prefer this third-person action shooter over the frustrating survival horror-esque gameplay. The first aspect of design I want to touch on is the mission structure, which unfortunately, like Alan Wake, is a bit on the repetitive side. Talk to person A to get clearance for an area so you can talk to person B. Person B wants you to clean the pipes before giving you access to meet person C. Could this have just been a phone call so I can skip to the fun part? However, every new environment is interesting to explore, you have meaningful power progression with fresh abilities, and it's well acted with interesting plot points. Not to mention, the gameplay will always be fun enough to keep you distracted from any low points. Also, having small details like the way a door reconstructs with a fractal pattern as you approach is downright mesmerizing and feels so unnecessarily interesting, you can't help but appreciate the thought that went into it. While nice to look at, level design had me getting lost more than a few times, especially in the more office-looking areas. I'm generally pretty directionally challenged, but I found myself extra reliant on the minimap here, which was sadly quite unreadable. The game has lots of verticality in the layouts, and the minimap is completely flat, which could just be misleading or frustrating at times. Back to a positive, Control features pop-up events in the world that add a lot of life. You're in this setting amidst an emergency and hostile takeover, so it makes sense to have emergent threats appearing suddenly, even if you're in the middle of another mission. It's always optional to switch over to them, but made for some nice atmosphere and an occasional change of pace. Another mechanic we've kind of grown to expect in games, even when it doesn't map onto the genre perfectly, is these supporting loot systems to flesh out progression. This sort of thing was missing from Alan Wake, and at the beginning of Control I appreciated it as an additional pursuit. A few mods here and there for your weapons, a hidden box with a small jumping puzzle, not too bad. Yet at the end of the game, I found this aspect to be mostly sloppy and underdeveloped. My inventory was constantly full of junk with mostly duplicates and low tier items. It felt really silly going out of my way in the level to find a chest just for it to reward me with a tier 1 duplicate of something I already had. Then I dismantle it to avoid running out of space and am rewarded with 200 currency, of which I already have 100,000. In Control, you can choose which areas of talents you want to invest skill points into, and perversely leaning into a specific method of play can punish the utility of your mods. For example, I decided to go for a seize build, where I take control of as many enemies as possible for a long duration. Speccing fully into this meant that I put no points into the ground slam at all and couldn't even use it as an ability. Finding a hidden crate 15 hours into the game with a mod that gives 5% extra damage following a ground slam was beyond useless to me. It's not an entirely bad system, and the bit of flexibility to weapon and personal modifications allowed more freedom of combat style, but when easily 75% of what I found was effectively unrewarding, I think that demonstrates a system in need of some tuning. Another design area lacking polish was the enemy levels. I can definitely understand why this was in place, but still would have appreciated more thought behind it. Control was made on a budget of around $35 million, which is insanely low and impressive for the standards of AAA games. This means you can't necessarily have 30 different enemy types of increasingly difficult mechanics to introduce over the course of the game. Enemy variety was good in Control, and as you progress through the game you'll see a higher level over their head to indicate this is the same unit but a tougher version that is scaling alongside you. However, it never felt to me like this information was useful or impactful. I mentioned earlier that I played a seize build, and the trigger requires you to first weaken an enemy before being able to take control of them. I had a problem from the start to the end of the game that I would one-shot many units, leaving me unable to bring them onto my side. Maybe my upgrades were lucky to always be scaling perfectly, but if I'm one-shot killing a level 1 in the first hour with my shotgun, and then one-shotting a level 9 in my 9th hour with a shotgun, I don't feel like having levels is even necessary. And then to make matters worse, in the final mission they randomly make all combatants jump 20 levels. For the first time I felt worried seeing such a big spike, and yet it felt like barely anything had changed at all, leaving me questioning what the scaler even is behind the leveling system. This doesn't ruin the game by any means, and will probably fade into the background for 95% of players. But hey, you're here to listen to me nitpick and give praise, so I can't leave these things out when I notice them. But speaking Speaking of which, let's close this section out with some praise. In Alan Wake 1, I mentioned a particularly enjoyable and memorable musical sequence, and oh man do they dial it up for Control. It's so fun, so creative, uses physical space in interesting ways, and blasts music that goes damn hard. This passion and interesting sequences are found not just in the main campaign, but even in the DLC side quests, where one mission turned into a neon Subway Surfers style minigame coupled with a jamming electronic song. Or you find a 90-second projector tape of a scientist singing and dancing. It's all so silly and unnecessary that you can feel the developers just having fun, and the enjoyment was infectious to me as a player. One more example I'll tease is an optional mission where you must enter a sensory deprivation tank, and during this time you are guided through a philosophical Japanese meditation. Super bizarre, absolutely love it. I kind of covered all my highlights in this section, so even though it doesn't fit perfectly, I'm gonna talk a bit about the sound design, which is super great. There is a near constant flow of unnerving murmurs humming in the background of the environment, and the main enemy, appropriately named the Hiss, emanates a noise fitting of its moniker. Very effective at being creepy. Couple notes on the expansions. The AWE DLC takes a shift towards a more survival horror-esque gameplay, but not entirely. Narratively, it does a good job at expanding the world building and hinting at wider connective tissue to other branching story ideas. Great stuff to make me invested in future games. Also, a cool tone departure to go more forcefully into a creepy atmosphere and less sci-fi. In the Foundations DLC, I'll say it's very heavy on the written lore. This game asks a lot of you in terms of stopping to read if you want to fully understand the details of the setting. For me, I tried to take in as much as I can, but pages upon pages can have a negative impact on the pace sometimes. However, I really enjoyed the change in environment to a more naturalist setting, and the new enemy types were well needed by this point. The structures you move through have a great sense of tension and release as tight caves lead to massive open areas. In general, not just here but in the base game, there are areas with a fantastic sense of scale to them. While playing Alan Wake, there were long stretches of time that felt unenjoyable to me, but I kept playing for those few great moments and ideas scattered throughout. Control took the low points and brought them up to be at the bare minimum always playable and enjoyable. It took the high points and pushed them further while also upping the frequency. Then it added a layer of polish, style, and identity to the whole thing. Some of the same issues still plague it, like a weak finale too reliant on teasing what's next, repetitive mission structure, and undercooked supporting systems. But in general, there's no denying this game is fun to play, beautiful to look at, and narratively interesting. However, above all else, it's the unique creative risks that make me want to continue supporting this studio, because they're doing things you just really don't see in many other blockbuster games. Alan Wake 2 pushes the limits once again and manages to surpass its predecessors in a handful of ways. Yet the ambition and big swings sometimes result in misses, creating an experience that in my opinion reaches both the highest peaks and close to the lowest valleys on overall game quality. We're back into the survival horror genre to continue the story from Alan Wake 1 13 years later. The town looks familiar and the themes of light and dark are present. Yet beyond that, the new creative risks and improvements to technology make it a significant departure from Alan Wake 1, starting with an opening sequence that was gory and, for maybe the first time, genuinely frightening. Alan Wake 2 drops you right into a beautiful environment from the get-go. A dark, dense, mossy forest that makes you feel the dampness coming out of your screen. Branches poke from the ground to break the silhouette of the terrain, fog hovers believably in the distance, and it's immediately clear how much the raw fidelity has jumped forward again. Camera angles for cutscenes are noticeably cinematic and intentional, rather than a boring shot reverse shot or anything too corny and gamey. In this game, the overall ground you cover feels smaller, but it's intentional and fits the style and pace for the game. Instead of sprinting between two checkpoints in Alan Wake 1 or flying your way through office levels in Control, Alan Wake 2 has you carefully moving through a handful of densely crafted levels. Sometimes you must explore the same area twice, but it feels natural, as maybe you needed to return to the scene of the crime. But at the same time, there's an effort in making things feel fresh when you return, like by changing the lighting to a beautiful golden hour with pink-orange hues in the sky, different from your first visit in the night, or lowering the water level from a recent flood, giving you access to a few new routes. I particularly loved being able to see one area of the map from another, giving that great sense of being in a real connected setting. Alan Wake 1 was worthy of similar praise, but here it's even more earned. For the urban environments, what stood out to me was the unbelievable attention to detail for the graffiti. The narrative of this series is heavily meta, with ideas permeating into dreams and other stories frequently. To reinforce this, environments like a subway are basically painted over with an entire layer of spray paint with key words, symbols, and concepts that reinforce the overarching plot points and create a very unsettling atmosphere. In Control, Control, they introduced this sort of projector overlay effect where a video is layered on top of your screen's 3D environment. It was really cool, and this time around, not only did they improve upon it to the point where I felt like I was in two places at once, they gave a strong narrative reason in doing so. And lastly, I mentioned during the introduction that for the first time during these games, Remedy was able to genuinely invoke some fear in me, and that was in no small part due to the art design for the creatures. Absolutely disgustingly grotesque. Did not want to encounter that thing. I'll round this section out with a minor critique, and that is that the lighting at times would flicker and be a bit splotchy. Alan Wake 1 had no dynamic global illumination from what I could tell, since bounce lighting wasn't noticeable and shadowed areas could be frustratingly dark. Control was indoors and the lighting was pretty straightforward. Alan Wake 2 has to light outdoor areas in multiple weather conditions and a ton of two-sided translucent foliage, which can be a nightmare for perfectly solving performant global bounce lighting. So I'm sympathetic, but at the same time, I have good hardware and it was noticeably broken at times. The gameplay of Alan Wake 2 features a slower, more methodical pace than Control or Alan Wake 1. There's effort not just put into further fleshing out the mechanics of light and dark, but also in adding a new system for detective sequences. I really enjoyed this player fantasy of stepping into a crime scene, looking for clues, recording evidence, then pinning together details on a huge pinboard. Other games I've played haven't given me an experience like this before, and every time I found evidence to trigger a new deduction and progress the case, it was satisfying. Not only did this spiderweb of notes and photos work as a believable mechanic, it also diegetically served as an in-game reminder for key plot points. A quick narrative summary at my fingertips whenever I need it. Another area you can tell a good amount of time went into was the puzzles. In general, I thought they were quite well designed. A good mix of creative tasks that made you feel clever and fairly challenged. However, one series of problems in particular that bothered me were the doll placement puzzles. The game would provide you with a small poem, a few figurines, and symbols for you to place them. These were often convoluted and intentionally confusing in a way that I find hard to imagine anyone nails them on the first try without a few unpunished guesses. For example, after being provided a wolf, a man, and a woman doll with symbols of a home, forest, lake, and boat, the puzzle may read, "One day a man leaves his wife at home to head to the forest to gather lumber for a boat. His wife, while dreaming of the lake, is attacked by a wolf. Quickly the man rushes home, ignoring his plans for the boat." And the solution is to place two figures and match them with two symbols. Needlessly complex, packed with red herrings, and I had to brute force my way through these a couple of times. Combat compared to the first game is not even close. This one blows it away. From more satisfying gun feel, like weapons kicking back hard, to visual details like enemies goring up as you blast away big fleshy chunks from them, there are a handful of improvements to appreciate here. And little things like customizing your quick select menu, which is standard fare but still nice to have. You have to be sparing and conscious with your resources, and finding loot for upgrades was impactful, often changing the way you played. For example, once I gathered enough manuscript bits to unlock healing from shotgun kills, I kept it in reserve during fights and pulled it out once I had taken a hit. Another fun one was giving your crossbow arrows the ability to magnetize other bullets, meaning an opening shot from your bow allowed you to go trigger happy with the pistol, ensuring every pull found its mark. While it's true that I found the combat more enjoyable and tactical to play, to me it's by no means stellar or one of the strong reasons you should play this game. I definitely have a personal preference against this genre, but still I'll try to explain my issues with specific details and examples. To start, there is this sort of stealth mechanic that was so tedious to work around, I thought I perhaps just entirely misunderstood the intention. Often you encounter areas you must pass through that are dense with shadowed figures. It's impossible to know at a glance which are real enemies and which are simply fake out shadows. To deal with these, your first option is to move slowly through them with your flashlight off. This brings the pace to a crawl, and with no flashlight, you are unable to detect key secrets in the environment that may reward you with upgrades. If you want to destroy them, you must hold your flashlight on them one at a time for 10 seconds each, waiting for them to either fade away or reveal themselves as a true enemy. The worst possible outcome is to get caught off guard by a real enemy, so I spent a lot of time in game just slowly working my way through hordes of shadows, beaming them down with a flashlight one at a time, which wasn't exactly thrilling. In Control, when you encountered a more difficult fight, it felt like you were entering a flow state as you began to juggle various abilities, cooldowns, and weapons. In Alan Wake 2, I found the more difficult encounters to often go one of two ways. What played out first would usually be that I make an effort to conserve resources and find myself quickly overwhelmed. 4 enemies rush me, I stun them all with my flashlight, dump my full magazine into the first, and while reloading, get stun locked by the others until I die, with seemingly minimal intelligent counterplay. Realizing this is not a situation I can get out of easily, I respawn, spam flashbangs, and effortlessly complete the encounter. I played on medium difficulty, and I'm not fantastic at this style of gameplay, but for me, I almost never felt like the challenge was perfectly teetering on the edge of being too hard and too easy, in the sweet spot where it's actually rewarding. This was especially apparent in boss fights, which made two factors uncomfortably obvious. this. The game knows you can't win without ammo, which means if you got to this point scraping by and have 3 bullets left, it simply won't be enough to kill this beefy boss. And second is that the movement is too stiff and limited to allow for a more creative moveset to defend against. So leading into the boss fight, you're showered with resources, and during the boss fight, the enemy can't do much more than rush at you while you simply tap L1 to sidestep it. 22 hours into the game, I completed a boss fight in 60 seconds on my first try. I used my flashlight to stun lock it, same as any other enemy, then cycled through my newly acquired arsenal. I paused briefly to reload while effortlessly dodging its first attack, then continued my onslaught. It felt very anticlimactic, and other times when I was cornered by just 3 grunt enemies, it was more punishing. And for my last nitpick on combat, it's that while I found the gore system to be satisfying and generally better to have than not, it became increasingly distracting that the system was not local to the area of damage, meaning I could put 6 shots into an enemy's chest and then watch their leg rip apart into bloody chunks. Now onto some level design thoughts. I highlighted this in the art section, but areas feel more compact in a way that I liked. Interesting locations that evolve and feel very memorable. The broken, disjointed level design for the dream states was something I particularly enjoyed as well. Sometimes you would take a staircase down and come out the other side on top of a roof. These moments were effectively disorienting and technically interesting as well. But an oversight I didn't enjoy and felt particularly gamey is that key items are not interactable until you've progressed past the trigger that reveals their importance. I really like when I'm able to notice something sticking out ahead of time and then collect it and be rewarded later for my resourcefulness. Instead, here, when I noticed an object looking suspiciously out of place, I would circle it trying to grab it for a minute before admitting defeat and moving on. 20 minutes later, a story moment would say I actually do need that item, and now I need to backtrack and retrieve it. It kind of broke the detective immersion when I have to play on the game's predetermined rails. Mission design on the whole is much more interesting and varied with new mechanics, more enjoyable combat, and a beautiful world. Yet I still do think Alan Wake 2 suffered from some repetitive structure, where to me, 5 to 6 hours could have been cut out for an improved experience. Progress in the Nightmare Realm seemed arbitrary and cyclical, which they very cleverly disguise as being thematic and even make comments on it. I'm trapped in a loop, they will say, which is cool, but also, I don't want to feel like I'm trapped in a loop as the player. We would return to the same location so often it became a running joke for me and my wife as she watched me play through it. A sequence would end, and I'd jokingly say, "Back to the tower?" To which Alan Wake would respond, "I must return to the tower." In a game that excels when it's shrouded in intrigue and creative storytelling, predictable and repetitive is the last thing you want to be. My last design criticism is that for a game with a focus on resource management for combat, some stashes expended more ammunition to get to than they rewarded. This was not the norm, and maybe it was an inefficient use of weaponry on my part, but sometimes it was the case that I would see a container located on my map off the beaten path, and in approaching it I would have to kill 3 enemies before gathering my loot. In doing so, I used up 15 bullets, yet in the container, only collected 10. And finally, some praise to balance it out. The audio design I thought was great. Similar to Control, the enemies in particular have a great sonic identity to them. Unnerving ghastly whispers and name calling still stand out vividly in my mind. In 2023, Alan Wake 2 won Best Narrative at the Game Awards. I think this game far exceeds Alan 1 without question, and the writing quality in general is much better regarding characters, tone, and world building. And yet, it falls for some of the same traps as other games I've discussed in this video, in addition to some other frustrating tropes. To start off, one of the most satisfying aspects of the narrative in Alan Wake 1 is how it continues to tie together and build on the lore of this world. Ideas that were hinted at in other games get fleshed out, and characters you know and love have exciting new roles to play. There is such a rich web of connections and mysteries that it made it so fun to keep guessing what would happen next. As I mentioned before, I played this game with my wife watching, and we would predict and discuss as though we were watching a weekly detective series meets the MCU. Alan himself as a character feels much more full, interesting, and in general likable. We're sympathetic to his situation, and he's become more expressive and funny. The writing in general embraces much more the idea of being intentionally campy and silly, which I personally really appreciated. It doesn't take away from the darker moments, but it's better than being so self-serious when moments are in fact a bit over the top. Some scenes are approaching several layers of meta, which is simply ridiculous yet fantastic. One of my favorite moments is when a talk show discusses how fans are confused and have been waiting a long time after the ending of the last Alan Wake story, which of course works for his novels in the game, but obviously the first game and us as the fans. Many of these moments occur during live action sequences, which are the longest and highest production value yet. I'm glued to the screen every time and sometimes wonder if Remedy is a game studio just to push their secret dream dream of making movies and musicals. Act 1 is a lot of setup, but it's compelling and hooked me in. Act 2 hits its stride as a well-written detective mystery narrative with a simple but appreciated mechanic to somewhat determine the order you play the missions within some rails. I said that Alan Wake feels like a better character, which is true, yet I can't help but be annoyed with the constant plot device of regression. It seems thematic since they are constantly saying out loud how the characters are losing their sanity, and these non-physical worlds are loops meant to trap you, but it doesn't make it any less annoying. I felt like as a player and a character, I was on the edge of discovery and safety in the Alan Wake 1 DLC. In Alan Wake 2, I feel like I've gone backwards, and sometimes so much of the story progress can match this cyclical format. An important part of the game design is knowing how long your game can be fun for, and in this case, they missed the mark by about 5 hours in my opinion. To me, the third act really begins to fall apart, and ultimately once again results in an unsatisfying ending that cheaply has me looking forward to what's next. Some entirely central characters and important plot points are not even close to resolved. It felt in some ways like I finished a part 1 style game where the story was split in half. Another specific narrative issue I had was the underdevelopment of central antagonists. In Alan Wake 2, to give some credit, for the first time in these games, I can name interesting and memorable secondary villains, which is great, yet the primary source of evil falls very flat, which is especially unfortunate because part of the DLC takes more time to explore this area of the narrative, and I actually enjoyed it a lot. I didn't know where to stick this complaint, but one of the main characters, meant to be an American, was voice acted by a British woman. The only reason I knew this is because I could hear her accent slipping through her line delivery. It was distracting to the point where I was expecting a story twist of her being from England or something. I don't understand how something like that can make it into the final game, and it was only on maybe 5% of her dialogue, which made it even worse. During serious moments, I would cringe in disbelief whenever this occurred. And the last minor gripe, but a super pet peeve of mine, is when characters allude to conversational moments that didn't happen. It can be okay to off-screen a decision and use it as an effective reveal later, but it felt like they were off-screening moments while on screen. Two characters would be talking and it would play out like this: "What should we do? It has to be dark." Really? Do you think that could work? Okay, let's do it. Like, excuse me? You're having this discussion in front of me and just skipped any actual substance. It's written like a children's show. In addition, they would repeat important plot points to make sure I got the message, even though I understood things perfectly fine the first go around. The issues in this game are particularly sad because when I was 15 hours in, I was recommending this game to everyone I knew. By 25, I was much more apprehensive. In the totality of my script, it's probably been most negative, but the truth is that these games produce some of the most conflicted feelings I've had. There are sequences in Alan Wake 2 that I genuinely consider to be sitting comfortably in S tier, and it's those moments that guarantee I'll keep coming back for more. In particular, they push the mixed media genre to new limits, featuring styles of storytelling I didn't think could possibly be effective in a video game. Text-based choose-your-own adventures, even comic book style slideshows captured my full attention flawlessly. One moment that absolutely blew me away was when I paused in the environment of a theater. I noticed a film had begun to play and I stopped to see what it would be. 20 minutes later, I realized I had just watched an entire art house short film from over the shoulder of the protagonist and didn't regret it for a moment. This was created entirely to serve the purpose of the game, and yet it was completely original. You simply don't see other studios doing this, and I appreciate it so much. The music as well was once again on another level. 10-minute rock ballads stuck in my head for days, catchy synth pop tunes immediately saved to my Spotify playlists. The highlights of Alan Wake 2 shine very, very bright. If you enjoyed my critical analysis of Remedy's Alan Wake and Control games, make sure to subscribe and check out some of my other gaming videos. I'll absolutely be playing Control Resonant later this year, and I'm so curious to see how this studio will continue to evolve their formula. While I believe Alan Wake 2 reached new heights over Control, I think I found Control to be the more balanced experience of the two, with a superior enjoyable baseline throughout. If Remedy can continue to integrate creative sequences, great world building, and strong art direction while correcting for their third act woes and weaker combat subsystems, I think they have the talent necessary to evolve from creating good games with unforgettable moments to great games you must recommend to everyone.